This morning's panel on the budget starts with four really experienced legislators on this only bill that the legislature has to pass. And I'll start here with Senator Chuy Hinojosa, a Democrat from McAllen. He's the vice chairman of finance, among other committees. He was a member of the House from 81 to 91, then again from 97 to 2003. He's been in the Senate since 2003. He's an attorney, served in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, and was the quarterback at Mission one time, back there. So if you want to talk football, ask him about Lyle Larson's bill. Representative Donna Howard is an Austin Democrat. She's on appropriations, the vice chair of calendars on higher education, and there's a fat asterisk on everybody in the House. Nobody has a committee assignment yet. We don't even have a speaker, so that could all change. She's been a member since 2006. She's a critical care nurse, past president of the Texas Nurses Association. She was an Eanes School Board member, married, 3 kids, 3 grandchildren. 4 grandchildren. Sorry.
And one on the way.
My Facebook page didn't update. So, Representative John Zerwas is a Republican from Richmond in Fort Bend County, chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the House. He's on the Legislative Budget Board. He's been a member since 2007. He is an anesthesiologist, one of 4 doctors in the House. Married, 6 kids, and I think 6 grandchildren.
7.
7, okay. The state is growing. Senator Lois Kolkhorst is a Republican from Brenham, Texas. She is chairman of the Administration Committee in the Senate. She's on Finance, Health and Human Services, among other committees. She was a member of the House from 2001 to 2014 and has been a Senate member since. He's a business owner and investor, married, 2 kids.
No grandkids.
No grandkids, okay. So, good, we passed the first test. I guess the easiest place to start on the budget is, what do you expect? We've sort of, Texas always seems to have kind of a Winnie the Pooh budget. The hurrier you go, the behinder you get. There was a number from the Texas Taxpayers Association about a year ago that said when the legislature gets here, the difference between what they're doing now and what they expect to bring in is going to be $7.9 billion. Glenn Hager lowered that a little bit. The controller came in and said, I've got $2.8 billion more than I thought I'd have, so you're only $5.1 billion behind. How's this look, just from the top? As you walk into the session, what do you think you're looking at? Anybody?
Well, good morning. Actually, I'm very happy that we're going to end this budget year in the black with about $2.7 billion. When we left last session, we only had about $50 million left in our bank account. But from the top, the reality is that we have a supplemental budget to take care of when the session starts, and that will cost us quite a bit of money. I think this $2.7 billion will be pretty much eaten up very quickly. We underfunded Medicaid by about $2 billion plus. I think we took $400 million under House Bill 30 to shore up the teacher retirement system. We have about $800 million of hardware-related expenses. You add those up, so we're already at about $3.5 billion in the whole, if you will, starting next session. So what the revenue predictions will be by the Comptroller's Office, I do not know. Obviously, we're concerned because while our economy is very strong, we continue to lead the nation in creation of jobs. Our challenge is the price of oil continues to fall and decrease. It's one of our main sources of revenue. We also have trying to make education a priority. That will take money. So when we look at all these challenges, quite frankly, every session is different. And every session we manage to somehow add up the numbers, move money here and there, and use different counting techniques, if you will, to have the budget certified. But from my perspective, quite frankly, people think we're going to have a lot of money. I'm very much concerned about the price of oils. I think Governor Abbott also suggested that we try to cap property taxes for public schools at 2.5. But that means that somehow the state has to make up the difference. So we still have a lot of challenges. I'm not, probably I'll get to know more when the session starts, but I don't think it's going to be as easy as sometimes you read when we have $2.7 billion in our bank account, the challenges that we face are many, especially dealing with our retirement systems that are also very much in need of money. The ERS, Employment Retirement System, needs about half a billion dollars just to bring it up to standards. We have probably another $400 million that is needed by teachers just to deal with the retirement system they have, and about $1 billion to make the teacher retirement system sound. So we have a lot of challenges. I look at this coming session as just another one where you have to grind through the numbers and do negotiations, set up priorities.
Representative Howard, you've been through a bunch of budgets. Is this, I mean, we always kind of start in this position, don't we? Is this worse than normal? Is this normal? Is this?
Well, it really does vary. I think the senator laid it out pretty well, what we're looking at this time. I've been here long enough now that I was here when we had the huge shortfall in 2011 that we dealt with. And then we came back and had a surplus, which gave us a different perspective and different challenges to deal with. But, you know, we're very fortunate in this state to have the natural resources we have, the diversified economy we have, certainly concerned about the oil prices, but also still seeing a pretty strong economy here in our state. That being said, we have, since I've been around, never fully funded our balanced budget without using the techniques that the senator referred to. And, you know, back when we had a surplus with Representatives Otto and Darby leading it was when we cut back on some of the dedicated funds we were counting on to help certify the budget. I don't think we're going to have that kind of money this time to do, but the fact is, I think one of the challenges I see when we're having the debates about how to prioritize our spending and what to do with our budget is that we've never actually fully funded what we have. We rely on the deferrals and we rely on the dedicated funds at the same time that we get caught up in the political rhetoric of talking about cutting the revenue streams that we have. I think that's a false debate in the sense that we don't have enough funds right now to cover what we're funding. So I hope that when we have the kind of surplus that we're talking about having, when we have a little more wiggle room, when we have an economic stabilization fund that is anticipated to perhaps be as large as $16 billion in the next biennium, that we will look at how do we actually invest in the things that we say we're already funding, and then look at the challenges that the senator mentioned. I mean, clearly we have some supplemental needs we're going to have to be looking at. We know that we're going to have some expenses with the Hurricane Harvey, the pensions and the TRS care, and then if we're really going to deal with school finance, which most of the leadership of this state is saying we're going to deal with, that to me requires looking at how do we find some sustainable revenue streams for that as well, because we can't keep just cutting the slices of the pie differently and keeping the pie the same size. That's not going to get us where we need to go. So lots of things we need to be looking at and thinking about. I think we have room in there, if we're willing to talk about it, to invest in some of these things and take advantage of the current situation we have in a fiscally responsible way. I'm not talking about overspending at all. But, you know, again, there's going to be a lot of different perspectives in how we look at this, a lot of different challenges. And one more thing I'll mention right now is the franchise tax, which we have continued to erode over a period of time after we put it in place. The first major vote I had to take, Lois, was when we did the special session on the revised franchise tax and compressing property taxes by a third for the schools. What a way to get initiated into the legislature. But the fact is that was something we put in place to do a swap of revenue. And yet, once we got it in place, we've continued to whittle away at it ever since. And here we are again with high property taxes and wanting to talk about compressing them, but we are not even keeping up with the previous compression in terms of revenue. So a lot of challenges.
Representative Zerwas, break this down a little bit for us. You're going to start with a supplemental bill. You're going to have we don't know what the controller is going to say in terms of what money is available. But do you have an idea how big of a supplemental bill you're looking at? Senator Hinojosa talked about it a little bit. It looks like it could be, there's some decisions to make about how big you want it to be and how does that play into the next budget.
Right. Well, thanks for having us up here. It's always a privilege to be with my colleagues up here. I think what we're looking at probably a multi-billion-dollar supplemental bill for no other reason than things that, the senator and the representative have just said, as far as just think, we know we have these things. We know we've got upwards $3 billion because we created those holes. I call Medicaid the piggy bank. When we do everything, we realize we don't have enough money, let's just shortchange Medicaid. And it's something that we've done for a long time. Now, we always ante it up. We don't leave Medicaid without, the funds that it needs ultimately. And if you think about $1 billion a month of revenue that Medicaid needs from the state coffers, if we're $2 billion short, then, that means that in June, end of June, that's when we're going to run out of money to pay for Medicaid. Well, that's plenty of time for us to make up that amount of money.
So your deadline for a supplemental is kind of the end of the session.
Pardon me? Yeah, absolutely. In this case, it is. Now in 2011, as Donna just said, we shortchanged it 4 months. Well, that backs it up pretty close, and that's a difficult thing to achieve. We did. It was painful, and there were a lot of burn marks as a consequence of that. But it's going to be that. Plus, you've got the Hurricane Harvey expenses. We've got school safety issues that we have to take into consideration. But I will say this, from the top of leadership, the idea that we're going to need to access the Economic Stabilization Fund for these types of things is understood, So we're not going to be having what is sometimes a push and a pull at the highest level as to whether, we're going to tap into the state savings accounts. Donna said this is going to be a pretty robust account. When we get all said and done with it, in terms of what we're going to have available. Comptroller is talking about an investment strategy for some of that money, which I think is absolutely the appropriate thing done. We should have done it a long time ago, frankly. But I think we're looking at, in the order of several $1 billion that potentially could be needed in order to just create the supplemental needs that we have out there. Some of it's a little bit unknown right now in terms of the extent that property values are depressed in the impacted region related to Harvey. We're going to figure that out. But, there's some knowns out there. The unknowns, though, could be very, very significant. And we just have to be ready to, move that money in the rainy day fund in order to get across the finish line.
There's been a running conversation, Senator Kolkhorst, since Rick Perry was governor, that the rainy day fund shouldn't be used for rolling expenses, but should just be used for one-time expenses. And one of the arguments that I've heard this time, or one of the points I've heard made this time, is that Hurricane Harvey is a one-off, and that it actually is a rainy day. It sort of fits into the nickname of the Economic Stabilization Fund. Is the legislature, and in particular the Senate, going to be willing to go into the rainy day fund this time for things like Harvey, or is this fund still sort of a don't touch me thing in state budgeting?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Again, thank you for having me today. It's always great to be with my colleagues and my friends. Excellent question. Senate District 18, I represent all or parts of 21 counties, and all 21 counties were in the disaster declaration. So I'm very close to the damage and the fallout from Harvey. We continue to rebuild, and we have a long way to go. In the Senate, in Senate Finance, and I want to compliment Jane Nelson, the senator who chairs it. She's from North Texas. She had 0 counties in the disaster declaration, but she has been staunchly supportive of the needs and what we're going to have to do to pay for Harvey. In fact, as Senator Hinojosa knows, we have started every Senate Finance hearing with a briefing on the Hurricane Harvey and its financial impacts. So I do believe there's a willingness. I've heard Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick say that, unlike last session, and I think one of the things that's hard, John, you and I have talked about it in Senate, in your House district and in my Senate district, was we started last session with 2 budgets that were so far apart. They were $8 billion apart. And when you say that, I was looking at some numbers. That's almost the size of Rhode Island's entire budget that we just started apart. And I know that the House had a desire to get into the rainy day fund. In the end, the Senate did not want to. The compromise was, let's do it for one-time expenditures. We made the largest part of that was, our first step toward solving our mental health hospital crisis that we have. And, I want to thank Senator Zerwas. Don't run against me. Representative Zerwas. Please don't run against me.
It started right here.
Representative Zerwas. We got it up. That's right. Which was always fun. When Hager stepped down, he and I had constant conversation, and I appreciate that friendship. But, I appreciate John's leadership in the last session when it came down to closing out that budget. Because the House, because of how far apart we were, really had to slide some our way. And then we were able to agree on just under, I think it was $988.7 million out of the rainy day
There's
fund.
still a lot to do on those mental health facilities. The conversation about getting into the Economic Stabilization Fund isn't just about Harvey. There are a lot of other sort of one-time items out there that people are at least talking about.
And let me say this, Ross. We've been looking at numbers, and I think the Finance Interim Report is about to come out. I've seen the draft. If people ask, what is Harvey going to cost us? It's billions and billions and billions of dollars in all funds. But when you look at just agency cost, I think, one of the things was about $1.9 billion just in agencies, about 12 agencies. But we're going to have about $1.5 billion of that covered by the federal government. So we really were able to, and kudos to Governor Abbott and others that were working on some of the agreements that we got with the Trump administration. 90-10 match, unheard of, and it's really going to help Texas out. But the big numbers you're going to see are on public schools. And it's about 100 school districts, and it's going to be somewhere between $1 billion and $2 billion, depending on, there's some things statutorily we need to do, and then there's some things that we set a precedence with Ike that is going to run us between $800 and $1 billion on appraised values that, I think the Senate Finance Committee's talked very strongly in favor of. Of course, that's when you come back, it's a tough vote when you're voting on about $1 billion for 100 school districts. But I would like to take all of you in a car with me and let you see the devastation. It is almost unspeakable.
Senator Hinojosa, are we going to start a Rhode Island apart this time? Is the Senate going to come in with a number and the House going to come in with a number, and there's a gaping Rhode Island in between you?
No.
Well,
I didn't think we were going to be talking about Rhode Island, but here we are.
Well, actually, I'll give you some interesting numbers, and that is that as I was reading up on my notes, we only have control over about 20% of the budget. 80% of the budget is already committed by the Constitution, by statute, and it really leaves just a small amount of money. But keep in mind that the three articles, the three areas that 90% of the money goes to is education, healthcare, and transportation. Those three eat up 90% of the budget. It's really, when you look at the numbers, it doesn't leave us much more left to do everything else that we have to deal with. I think, quite frankly, that the House and the Senate will be closer together on the budget than last session. We were so far apart. The big dispute was non-formula funding items for higher education. We've been trying to work up and come up with a better system so that we don't have to have non-formula funding called special item funding that's been there for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And it's never worked into the formula funding. There was a big, difference in last session. In terms of the rainy day fund, I think just the general discussion, we have about $11 billion balance. I think we have to use the rainy day fund this coming session just to make ends meet, especially if we are going to make reforming the public school financial system in place. To me, when we talk about rainy day fund, it is raining. And without using the rainy day fund, I don't think we can make ends meet this coming session.
So we're going to get a multi-billion-dollar supplemental bill. We start a little bit behind, or a lot behind, on the regular budget, and the speaker and the governor and the lieutenant governor all want to take on the most expensive problem in state government and fiddle with school finance. Where's the money for that going to come from? And what is it that you call a fix for school finance?
I obviously don't know what the answer is. There are some things we could be looking at. Certainly, I haven't heard a demand for eliminating the franchise tax, as some are calling for, from those that actually pay it. I think that there's a recognition among the business community at large that there is reason to be supportive of an educated workforce pipeline, and we actually have a fairly low tax rate now that applies to a relatively small number of businesses in the state. So if anything, I think we could look at, the original concept was, how do we have a low-rate, broad-based tax that is equitably distributed across services? And, so there's things to look at there. You wrote a column on the exemptions that we have. There's talk, of course, as we've had multiple times, about do we sunset those and look at those and examine that a little better. There's some that have outlived their usefulness. So those things are there. But when we're talking about the Economic Stabilization Fund, I want to point out as well that we talk about it in terms of one-time expenditures, and I think we all get that it's not responsible to go to your savings account for your ongoing expenses. I mean, I think we all understand that. But we also have used the revenue stream that goes into the Economic Stabilization Fund for ongoing expenses. So, for instance, when we created the State Highway Fund, that is an ongoing expenditure to support transportation that is coming from money that would have been in the Economic Stabilization Fund, but instead we have diverted to an ongoing expenditure. And I believe, if I understood him correctly, this week even, Senator Betancourt made some comment about looking at surplus, whatever that surplus is above, I don't know yet, but a diversion of some sort again that might help with the funding of schools. There are things we could look at. And so it's without even bringing in new taxes or fees. The final thing I would say is what John referred to as the legacy fund that's been proposed by the Comptroller's Office. Right. And Representative Capriglione and I both had legislation last time addressing this as well. That is money that is sitting in a virtual mattress. It is not even being invested to keep up with inflation.
This is the idea, to invest some of the rainy day fund money.
Yes, invest some of the rainy day fund and put it into another account where you can actually spin off new money, free money that is not coming out of taxes. That is just money that is making money off of money. And use that to help fund some of the underfunded liabilities, freeing up general revenue to pay for some of the things that we need to be paying for.
Is there a bag of magic beans out there somewhere big enough to cover a school finance fix?
Oh, I figured that's what you were going to tell us, what that bag of magic beans were, I got no idea. There's not, but I think, my colleagues have already sort of touched on this a little bit. What we really need to have is some cover politically, especially on our side of the aisle, to talk about, where are there other ways of raising revenue in order to meet what we've all agreed at the Senate, the executor, and the and us in the House, is that we're going to tackle school finance, and school finance is intricately involved in depressing property taxes. You can't do one without the other. And then you've also got to address your appraisal process, And so all these things are wrapped into one. But if you're going to actually relieve people of property taxes, which is what bolsters up the schools right now, you've got to look on the state side for some source of revenue. The franchise tax, was never going to, compensate for that amount that we pushed down. Now it was played like it was going to. But it didn't, and there were people who said that it wouldn't, and we see now in hindsight that it's not going to be able to do that. And so let's accept that even probably in its best situation, it still isn't going to provide us the revenue that the state would need in order to pick up what I would say its obligation is, which is 50% of the burden of the schools. And so if we go on that basis, then, let's talk about other places that revenue can be generated. And broadening the tax base to some extent is one of those ways to do that.
Okay, so when you say broadening the tax base, what was hidden under that phrase?
So if we
Move
just
over here like this.
Everybody leaned away from it.
So you have to have the cover. We depend most heavily on our sales tax, but yet there is a very large number of things that are not taxed. There's a large number of businesses that aren't taxed in the franchise tax. So I mean, it's a scary place to go. Especially for us that don't like to really talk about that. But when you explain to people that you are going to benefit from a property tax point of view, which is in District 28, and I would guess throughout the Senate District, that is the number one thing that they are concerned about, second to Harvey recovery, second in school safety. This is the number one thing, that in the appraisal process. And you don't get there unless the state has the ability to look at other ways. Now, I'm all about the schools functioning as efficiently as they can and taking advantages of their reserves in a responsible way and things like that. But ultimately, I think we're going to have to find, a way to create sustainable revenue that's going to allow us to pick up a multi-billion-dollar obligation that we would have to bring the state's share up to 50%. And so, I would say, hey, let's look at that. Now we're not going to do an income tax. We know we're not going to do an income tax, so throw that out as a potential alternative revenue source. Spending off money from the rainy day fund investment, good idea, great idea. It's criminal that we haven't done it, frankly, in the past, but it's not going to spend the amount of money off that's going to drastically improve our ability to pay for schools. But what it will do is help us with some of the unfunded liabilities in our pension plans. And that is probably the number one thing that potentially could cripple our credit rating.
This
And
is
so
ERS,
I'm all for,
the employee retirement system, the teacher
yes,
retirement
exactly.
system.
So it's the thing that's crippled Illinois and any number of other states out there, So I think that's something that we definitely need to look at. I think that using the rainy day proceeds as an investment vehicle could accomplish some of that. But when we look at, the demand for funding for our schools, we've got to look at, where can you get the biggest bang and something that's going to be sustainable for that. And I would say, let's look at it, let's talk about it, but let's also have, frankly, the political cover to talk about it, to determine, okay, have we uncovered, the magic bag of beans, that's going to say, this is how we're going to do it. There is no magic bag of beans, we've been down this road. We created a franchise tax in order to, pick up our liability, if you want to call it that, our responsibility for schools. It didn't work. It's only grown more. School, property values have increased. Our obligation has decreased. And that is what people, I think, across the state, certainly in my district, are having the greatest concern about right now.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing. Chairman Zerwas mentioned 50% should be our share, the state's share in this partnership with the local communities to offer public education. And in fact, when we did the 2006 property tax compression, that's where we got back to, leaving off the federal part, the state local, we got to about 50% at that point in time, and it has slowly eroded over time as property values have gone up because of the way the funding formula is set up. But as Chairman Zerwas also knows, I had legislation last session that would have taken us back to 50% of the share, but it was the largest fiscal note I think that had ever come to appropriations. Because it's kind of like, if you don't fix that leaky roof over time, eventually the roof falls in, and that's kind of where we are now. The roof is falling in. We've let it go for many years now, so the bill has gotten higher and higher. It was like $23 billion if we wanted to get back to the state paying for 50% of the cost of public education at status quo, not even putting more money in. Right. That's how expensive it was.
Let me add to that. Here's something that's pretty interesting. Since 2008, the state's share of funding has gone down 2.1% every year. 2.1. This is why now we're at 38%. The difference is picked up by local property taxes when they increase the value, the appraisal value of property. And it's a real challenge to come up and confront that issue as how do we pick up our share so that we can have lower property taxes for our public schools from our local property taxpayers.
But the point being is the formula works like that, and it's all on the backs of appraisals. It's not like the legislature woke up and said, we're just not going to fund our schools. It was the fact of how the formula works. And it's a bucket, and the first bucket is filled by local money because they're local ISDs, and the last part is funded by the state. So as that local share grows, the state share pulls back. Unlike cities, counties, MUD, SUDs, and other special utility districts, our school districts, as your appraisals go up and they leave the rate at $1.04, which used to be $1.50, and that was a big vote to compress that, they don't necessarily get more money because we're pulling back on state money, as opposed to counties and cities. When the appraisals go up and they leave the rate there, they are getting more money. So school districts have always, struggled on that, and it's just a fact of how the formula works.
As you rewrite, or as you approach school finance, is that formula going to stay intact, or is that formula proved to be a political problem? I mean, do you want it to stay that way? Do you want the buckets to work the same way? And
Yeah, I follow the School Finance Commission. I don't think any of y'all were on it, but I followed it very closely in looking at their recommendations. Rewriting a formula is very difficult. We tried to do it before the last court case in 2006. I guess, Chuy, you and I were the only two there. You were in the Senate at the time. Didn't go very well because you really did not have the threat of public schools shutting down. The Supreme Court, Texas Supreme Court, has warned us it's barely constitutional.
Right.
You need to act. So I do think that we need to act sooner rather than later, Ross. Some of that's going to be a combination. I think Chairman Zerwas said you have to look at appraisal reform. You have to look at putting, as you rewrite the formula, how money from the state goes in. A simple fix. And the governor said it about, like, if you just changed appraisals and said on your homesteads it goes from 110 to 105, that makes the state a better actor immediately because the bucket doesn't get as full because your appraisals can't go up as much. So,
but you have to have some magic beans to do that.
So you wrote a really interesting article this week.
Finally.
Yeah, that's what I said. But as a journalist from TCU myself, I was like, finally, Ross. You talked about the Hager, the Comptroller's office writes an annual report on exemptions, and that do we ever go back and really look at the exemptions in place? I think that Chairman Zerwas just mentioned that in a brief remark. It's time for us to look at some of that and to say, when we gave that exemption, it was for a certain reason. Is that reason still a need in the state of Texas? It should be a thorough and worthy exercise to turn over those stones to say policy and policy changes then may have met their needs, and now we can remove that.
Is the school finance problem, as a matter of policy, there's obviously a lot of stuff going on, but as a matter of politics, is the school finance problem really a problem if you don't have people screaming about property taxes? If this system was out of balance, but people weren't asking you in the first two questions at town hall meetings about their high property taxes, would this be a political problem? And that's a backdoor way to say, if you don't address property taxes in a way that lowers property tax bills, aren't you going to be back in 5 minutes working on school finance again?
I think the biggest question and complaint that I get from my constituents, quite frankly, is property taxes. For us, the only way we can lower property taxes at the local level is for the state to step up and pay more of their share for public school financing, for the public schools, support of public schools. I don't see any other way. And the reality is that if we don't put more state funding and increase our share, property taxes will never go down for supported, local property taxes will never go down. So we got to deal with it and face up to it.
Yeah, and Austin ISD, of course, is the poster child for what's been going on, and a lot of us have heard about that. But the fact is that in their current budget, they are sending more back to the state in recapture than they actually are keeping to spend on the students in their district. Now, we in Austin, we have property wealth that creates that situation and diminishing enrollment that adds to that formula. But I mean, I think it's still a good example of how dysfunctional this system is when you have, it's lowered now because of the decrease in students, but somewhere between 55 and 60% of the students would be considered low income. And also a very large English language learner population, which requires additional investments. So the Austin property taxpayer sees their bill going up and up and up, and yet they have less money with which to work for the students in their own district. And granted, everybody understands that when you're relying on property taxes with the disparity in property wealth across the state, you have to have some kind of a way to equalize that system. So Robin Hood, if you will, was conceived as a way to do that, but it was never looked at to this extent, where you have billions of dollars coming in from the recapture system, so that you have this real out of sync thing that the taxpayer sees. And then the final thing I'll say about that is, when you pay your property tax bill, you're paying it in good faith. Maybe you've challenged it, but when you finally pay it, you're paying X amount for your schools. And that's coming into the state. As Lois mentioned, we have a bucket to fill, and we only have to fill what's left over from state money. Well, when the local money comes in, like this last time, we had like an additional $7 billion that came in from property tax growth because of the values increasing. We didn't spend that entire $7 billion on schools. We used about maybe $3 billion of it in general revenue to help pay for some of our other programs. All well and good, except you paid that tax for schools. So part of what a lot of us are talking about is, if you're going to be taking money from the taxpayer for schools, then put it into schools.
Ross, I want to throw in a couple of statistics here.
Okay. You pulled out her notes.
Robin Hood started in 1993. You know, I know we all say, you know, Robin Hood now, but in 1993 there were only 34 school districts that were subject to Chapter 41. And then if you look at how it's grown now, you have 441 districts in Robin Hood, which is a third of the school districts.
Not all of them are paying, right? So
That's
all
right.
all of them are in the
250 are paying.
Right. Okay.
And so I had a superintendent tell me the other day, a false 41 or a fake 41. I'd never heard that term, but fake 41. Some of the fake 41s make out pretty well with that, which he was explaining to me.
What's a fake 41? Help us.
Fake 41 doesn't have to pay the money back because they're in that gap, and so they're in a sweet spot. If you're a fake 41, you're in a sweet spot. But having said that, this is a statistic that most of us don't know, is that 69% of the recapture districts are small, 53% of the recapture districts are rural, and only 7% are mid-size and 9% are fast growth. Kind of puts it in perspective that rural Texas is paying a goodly portion of it.
So let me move to some other areas. We've got a couple minutes, and then we'll open for questions here. Some other areas of the budget. There's an $800 million expenditure the state's been making in, I think, the last two budgets. That's a rough number, on border security. At the same time, the governors, Perry and then Abbott, were saying, you know, this is money that should be spent by the federal government, not by the state government. You've got a White House that's very concerned about the border now. Are they going to spend the money and let you guys off the hook and give you the 800 back so you can spend it on something else? Or is that still going to be in the budget? And that's a way to lead into, are there other things in the budget? Are there other big items in the budget where you say, maybe we don't need to do this anymore, or do this anymore, or do this anymore, and we can use that money for some of the other things you're talking about?
I'll jump in, because for the past several weeks, this has been what I've been involved in. They call it boards of review. So we take all the LARs that have been developed in the summertime, and then Senator Nelson and I sit at a table with the Legislative Budget Board, and we go through agency by agency. It's very stimulating activity, I must say. When they're doing it right now, while I'm here.
He's an anesthesiologist, people.
I'd rather be on a hot panel with you, man, than to go to the board of review. So, but truly, I mean, I think that's something that will come up. You know, the senator and I haven't had that conversation yet. The last 3 weeks here, we'll basically close out all the boards of review. We'll keep the big ones for the end here, which is what we're getting into right now. Nothing really stands out as something that is just not going to be there again. We will have that conversation around that particular funding. I think we should have that conversation. We should get a sense of, what is the federal government going to do to finally step up and relieve us of this burden. But in the meantime, if we don't, it's something that, based on the input that DPS gives us, we have to think about, are we doing the right things to keep the border safe? There's a lot of back and forth about that, and that's healthy. We should have that, So, but right now, I couldn't say that that's something that is necessarily coming out of the budget and is going to free up any revenue. I'm not confident, 2 years into the Trump presidency, that other than some of the things we've seen related to this migration, and threat to the border from that standpoint, right. I haven't seen anything, that tells me that we're going to really enhance the resources at the border at a federal level that are going to relieve us of the responsibility we have in that regard.
Do you see some things in the budget that are, I don't want to say that they're fat or waste, but maybe lower priority now and you can use the money elsewhere?
Well, let me talk about border security because, quite frankly, it's very difficult to have a discussion based on merits and public policy on border security issues. It's very politicized, and quite frankly, from the White House on down, it's an issue that cannot be discussed without politicizing it so much that people expect us as a state to secure the border and put in $800 million or so. Whether some of that money could be better used, obviously it could, but it's an issue that it's not going away.
Let me throw one more grenade, and then we'll open up for questions. There's a microphone over here. There's a microphone over here if you'd line up. When you do that, if you make a speech, I'm going to cut you off. Just keep it to a question so more people will have a chance to ask questions. The LBB recently met for its biennial exercise in setting a growth limit. You can't, you're spending this much money, you can't grow more than that much without a vote of the House and the Senate, and decided not to set one. What the heck?
You're on it.
Yeah, we just didn't want to do it, so.
Well, I mean, it sounds like with all the things you're talking about that there's going to have to be some conversation about the budget's growing faster than the old growth limit, and the House and Senate are going to have to vote on this.
Well, there will be, a spending limit put in place. We'll do that. We have to do that. We chose not to do it at that time because we really wanted to get a better sense of, okay, what is the revenue going to be like? But also, since we're going to be talking about school finance, let's be sure that we don't, back ourselves into a corner too much. Right. When we did school finance, and in 2007, we had the bust the spending limit. In fact, I think it was the first time we've ever had to take a vote to do that for, a $14 billion, sum of money that had to be dealt with and stuff.
And nobody got beat on that, did they?
Nobody got beat on that.
I mean, was there a political consequence to that?
No, I don't think there was there?
No, but we heard about it,
Right.
and certainly you should from your constituents if they're concerned about how much money you're spending. But if you look at the $14 billion was for schools, you just had to explain that.
Right. It's just exactly the same situation we're in right now. We compressed the tax down by a third. People felt that. I felt that, as a taxpayer when that all happened and stuff. And when people hear that, it says, we had to up the spending over here. And fortunately, we had the money to do it, and we could do it, But you also felt in your pocketbook in a very real way, a depressed property tax related to school support school finance. So, I think what we want to do is just, get to a point where we can set what we think is a realistic spending limit. Right. And there's kind of different ways that you can go about doing that. We just weren't ready to do it at that point.
Okay. We've got a few minutes here for questions. If you'll be quick with your questions, they'll be quick with their answers, and we'll get more people in. Yes, sir.
Hi. Regarding pensions, the private sector moved from defined benefit to defined contribution. I'm wondering why the state hasn't done the same.
Well, we actually had some studies that were done that were presented to us that looked at a variety of options, and that was a more expensive option for us ultimately. I don't remember what the details of it were, but it actually was not going to be beneficial for us to make that move.
Is that still a conversation as you go forward on the pension plans, or is that kind of a settled one?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things because I made some changes to the teacher retirement system back. It was myself, Craig Island, and Robert Duncan. We called it the three-legged stool. We kind of came together. We didn't even know each other were working on it. I ended retire, rehire. When I say ended it, changed it so that it wasn't the way it was and that the system wasn't being hurt. We did the rounding from 3 years to 5 years. We did some things that were very important back in the 2005 session. We have looked at this as some people want to say, okay, new teachers or new ERS employees coming in, we should move you to a defined contribution. The problem is when you do that, then they're not contributing to those that have already been there, and there's a feeling in the legislature that we've made a promise to some of the employees in TRS and ERS currently that we need to honor that. And so that's where it gets real expensive, is the fact that when you're coming in as a new defined contribution member, you're not giving to the defined benefit. So it's tricky, but I do think that it's always a worthy conversation, and I think there'll be more bills filed this session that'll get a good look.
Thank you. Yes, sir. You got a question?
My question is on teacher retirement as well. I'm about to retire, and I don't think I'm going to be able to. You guys made a promise to teachers a long time ago. You're failing us. I would like to know what you guys plan to do about it.
Well, I think one of the areas that is going to get a real focus, it got a real focus last session, was on healthcare. We had to change basically the plan format in terms of how it's supported. There's a pretty big dollar figure as a shortage this time again. As you know, we put nearly $500 million into it, but yet still there was significant premium burden by the retirees on that basis, and there were significant deductibles, and so paying a whole lot more money for what I would say is probably a lesser policy. And that in the private sector, of course, is what we've all had to deal with for quite a long time. So it's not new from that standpoint, but part of the problem was ours. The way we set up the plan, eliminated some premium burden by the retirees. Politically, that's a very good thing to do, and it's a helpful thing. But we're going to have to look at what can we do to recognize the fact that teachers have a fixed income. We've all seen what it is, and then all of a sudden they've got a healthcare burden that is enormous. I mean, that's money out of your pocket that is not to mention the high deductible costs. It's going to make your life different as a consequence of that. And I think we as a body, both in the House and the Senate, we need to look at this shortfall that we're going to have. We need to try to look for what would be a more permanent fix for it. But I will tell you, it's difficult and it's expensive. But the idea that we as your legislators up here, and really all the House and Senate, recognized the great value that teachers provide to this state, and that we need to make this as right as we can make it. And the only thing I would say is we got a little bit more money. I think I have a more rosy, optimistic view of what our economic situation will be going next session. Certainly the rainy day fund is going to be robust. We're going to have options available to us, which were fairly limited last session.
Are you satisfied, all of you, that the cost of living, or that the benefits in the TRS plan and the ERS plan keep up with inflation and growth? That's something that has to be
An
addressed.
automatic COLA is what you're saying?
I didn't say automatic anything. I just said, if you're talking about a defined benefit and a fixed income, is part of the problem that, that those aren't climbing with expenses? Is that something that has to be addressed, or is it fine the way it is?
Since I've spent some time in this regard, and the last time that the teachers received a 13th check was an issue that I worked very hard on, and we were able to do that. I was in the House. I was really proud of that. When you get into those COLAs and you start studying other states, and where they really got upside down was automatic COLAs. And so when we look at the legacy fund that Comptroller Hager is proposing as to shore up our big pension systems, I think it's really important. I think that it's been a long time since we've given any kind of raise to the teachers, retired teachers. My sister's a widow and a retired teacher and lives on that salary. She had a high deductible before we made the change, but I called her before we voted on the House bill that had come over unanimously. And It was kind of a tearful conversation, but we were able to get through it. Let me say this, for 12 years, nothing changed in the teacher retirement systems, the TRS care, nothing, no copay, and we didn't let any air out of the balloon gently as those prices and those costs were going up. This time we had to let a bunch of air out. I think we need to now shore it up. We made the catch up. In my estimation, it's going to be expensive. There's another shortfall. The underlying issue, John doesn't like it when I say this sometimes, is the cost of health care. And it really is driving, when we talk about no money for education, the Medicaid cost, everything is really being driven by healthcare costs. And I have hope one day that we will be able to see that bending the curve. We're doing some things that will bend that curve and keep people healthy. And that's how you make savings.
And yet I would say that I would say that we have, the four of us sitting right here have an insurance policy that has been kept up with to an extent that we are not overly burdened. I am not overly burdened. And so somehow we've made that okay. And I don't think we've kept up with what we need to do with the teacher system. And when we've had additional funds that could have been invested, we didn't do what we needed to do at the time. And that, as I said a while ago, builds up. And it makes it more and more difficult as the bill gets higher and higher, not to mention the rising costs of health care. So I think that there is more we can do. I think we tried to do more last time. I know that Chairman Ashby had some legislation and some things that he wanted to do in the budget that did not end up coming to fruition. There had to be compromises that occurred, but there's much more that needs to be done, and I'm very hopeful that we can get a lot of bipartisan support around this legacy fund, because I think that is a source of sustainable revenue that's going to be necessary for us to honor the commitment.
Just very briefly, I think that the teacher retirement system right now is pretty much not functional. What you have teachers on fixed income. And then you have no increase for cost of living increases. You have no increase to cover the increase in healthcare costs, especially prescriptions. So many times the teacher has to decide whether to buy food or buy the medicine. And the quickest fix right now in terms of this coming session, quite frankly, is an influx of funding from the state to shore up and lower the deductibles to something that's affordable to our retired teachers.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your comments that you've given us already, talking about the pensions and property taxes and all that. But I want to shift to another topic. The National Climate Assessment report that came out last Friday has some specific and very dire warnings about what's going to happen in the next few decades. And one of them is economic disaster, and I'm wondering what the state of Texas, what the budget committee is going to do to help us avoid any of these disasters, specifically, let's say, the economic ones. Is there anything in the budget already for that? I'm not aware of it, if it is.
Yeah, good question. I'm glad you brought it up, because it is something that didn't get quite the airing out there, if you will, in terms of when it was published and let out and so forth, But I'm not aware specifically that we have anything with regard to that. With regard to things that are happening that the state is doing that I think are very beneficial, in terms of trying to, protect our environment, to do something towards, handling the climate issues. We're the single largest producer of wind energy in the country by something like 20-fold. Solar energy is really on the rise now. You hardly see a home built these days that doesn't have some level of solar panels in it and so forth. And, conversion of a lot of our plants towards natural gas. I think nuclear is not quite where I'd like to see it, but it's a bit in the tank because of the expenses related to it and just some of the aura that comes along with that and stuff. But all those things very, very beneficial to our climate and stuff. So at least from the standpoint of what is the state of Texas doing that I think that is at least climate friendly, I think some of the biggest things, at least related to the production of electricity, we're doing some, I think, pretty progressive things in that regard.
And the budget question is largely what Hager puts into revenue, right? If he decides that this is going to have an effect on industry and it's going to have an effect on taxes, that's how it ripples to you guys, right? Got time for just a couple more here. Yes, sir.
Chairman Zerwas, you mentioned several times that you're going to need political cover. What does that mean, and who are you expecting to do that?
Good question, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, I mean, believe me, I've carried some bills that I didn't have any political cover on, and I'm still nursing those wounds. Medicaid expansion, exactly, it immediately came to mind, but there are things where I think at the highest level of our leadership, there needs to be at least a quote-unquote blessing that we have the opportunity to talk about these things, not necessarily to say they're all going to pass, I mean, say somebody wanted to throw an income tax out there, as an alternative revenue stream. Well, it's not going to happen, but I don't care if it's out there and you want to talk about it. I know what my position will be. I don't know what my colleagues will be, but, let's face it, we've never been an income tax state, and for many, many decades, this state was dominated by Democrat leadership. So I'm pretty sure that that's something that's going to happen. But fine, you want to put it out there and talk about it? Give me some political cover so that people can have the conversation and share the pros and cons, and the cons will far outweigh the pros. Boom, get it off the table, But don't let me get up politically, all beat up over something like that just being on the table and having a conversation. Now, I'm not going to carry the bill, maybe Representative Howard will carry it. I don't know, but I think that when we talk about doing things like broadening the tax base, whatever that be related to, if it's a franchise tax, if it's just the sales tax in general, if we're looking at, moving money, another revenue stream off of the contribution to the rainy day fund and moving that towards some kind of revenue stream that we can use otherwise, that's the thing that, when you start talking about these things and having the conversations, if you don't have cover, I think, from the highest levels of leadership, then you really get beat up on it, and it makes us not really want to even have the conversation.
Okay, got a question over here.
Thank you. I'm with Adaptive Texas. Our biggest issue right now is community integration. The boots on the ground are our personal care attendants, the community direct service workers.
Right.
They're now making $8 an hour as a base wage. We can't compete with that. We're saving the state millions of dollars of Medicaid funding by living in our own homes and receiving care from these programs with the direct care. The Texas Employment Commission or Workforce Commission just reported that's the #1 area of labor force needed in Texas.
If
but
you could
it
cut to
is
your question, that'd be great.
it is the lowest paid position in Texas. So what can we do to raise salaries to a livable wage of $15 an hour for all community workers?
Do you have something like this on your target list? Is there something about, the wages paid to those people? Is $15 a reasonable
We did do
wage?
that in recent sessions, and it was extremely expensive. I don't remember the number, and it raised it from 7 something to 8. Wow, and it cost a lot of money. Your point being well made, though, that this is a huge cost savings to the state if we invested that. Where we're going to find, I don't know what the dollar figure would be, but I think it would be a very large number we'd be talking about to raise from 8 to 15. At the same time, maybe not Lois, well, maybe, I don't know, a couple of us up here, we're looking at that age for ourselves right now. And we are the people that are aging and are going to need more and more of this caregiving. We need to be paying attention to that. And I think raising the salary is the way we need to go. It did wonders with the DFPS system. We need to be looking at it for this as well. I just know it's going to be a large number. I don't know what it would be.
I think that's it. I'm sorry. I think we're out of time.